The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the lives of countless men, women, and children in ancient Rome were not their own. Bound by chains both visible and invisible, they moved through the opulent halls of wealthy households like shadows, essential yet unseen. Picture this: a young woman, barely in her teens, stirring before first light to prepare her master's morning meal, her hands raw from scrubbing marble floors the night before. Or a man, once a warrior in his homeland, now silently standing guard at a lavish dinner party, his pride buried beneath the weight of servitude. This wasn't just work, it was a life stripped of autonomy, where every breath was dictated by the whims of those who owned you. Rome's elite relied on slaves for everything from cooking and cleaning to educating their children and managing their estates. But behind the grandeur of villas and the glitter of gold lay a world of unspoken suffering. What did it truly mean to wake up each day as property, not a person? How did one navigate the delicate balance between survival and dignity in a society that saw you as little more than a tool? The answers lie in the quiet corners of history, in the fragments of letters, legal records, and even the graffiti left behind by those who lived this reality. Today, we're stepping into that world not as observers, but as witnesses. We'll walk the narrow corridors of Roman households, feel the weight of the tasks that filled a slave's endless days, and uncover the unspoken rules that govern their lives. From the fleeting moments of camaraderie in shared suffering to the ever-present threat of punishment, this is a story of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. By the end, you won't just understand the mechanics of Roman slavery, you'll feel the heartbeat of those who endured it. So take a deep breath. The past is waiting, and its truths are more revealing than you might expect. Even in bondage, not all lives were valued the same. Within the walls of a wealthy Roman household, an invisible ladder separated those who served, a brutal hierarchy that determined who ate scraps in the shadows and who might dine on leftovers from the master's table. At the very top stood the educated Greeks, prized for their knowledge of philosophy, medicine, or languages. These were the tutors whispering Homer to wide-eyed patrician children, the secretaries drafting letters with elegant strokes of ink. Their skills bought them small privileges, better rations, lighter workloads, even the occasional whispered conversation with their owners as equals, at least in intellect. But step down just one rung and the reality hardened. Skilled artisans, cooks, weavers, or metalworkers could earn a measure of respect, yet their hands were never idle. A chef might craft delicacies for banquets, but one spoiled dish could mean the lash. Further down were the household drudges, the cleaners, the water carriers, the ones who emptied chamber pots before dawn. Their backs bore the weight of Rome's obsession with order, their lives a cycle of thankless labor. And at the very bottom, the field hands, the miners, the ones sent to labor under the sun until their bodies broke. This hierarchy wasn't accidental. Roman masters nurtured it deliberately, dangling the hope of better treatment to keep slaves from uniting. A Greek tutor might be allowed to wear finer clothing. A trusted steward might manage smaller sums of money, tiny rewards that stoked envy rather than solidarity. The message was clear. Obedience could earn you crumbs of dignity, but resistance would bury you at the bottom. Yet even in this fractured world, moments of defiance flickered. A scribe might subtly alter a letter to favor a fellow slave. A cook could spare an extra loaf for the scullery maid. These quiet acts of rebellion whispered a truth the masters feared. No system could fully extinguish the human spirit. The cruelty of this structure lay in its precision. A slave's value wasn't just measured in coins, it was calculated in syllables of Greek poetry, in the steadiness of hands that could polish silver without tarnish. And with every small privilege granted to some, the chains on all grew heavier, because in the end, whether you taught geometry or scrubbed floors, your body was still not your own. The auction block was where lives fractured, where a person became a price. In the heart of Rome's busiest markets, the air buzzed with haggling voices as merchants paraded their human wares on raised platforms. Buyers elbowed forward, prodding at limbs, demanding demonstrations of skill or strength. A scribe might be ordered to recite passages from Virgil, a dancer forced to twist her body to the snap of a whip. Even children weren't spared, tiny hands examined for dexterity, voices tested for clarity, their futures decided in the time it took to count out coins. But the cruelty of these markets wasn't just in the spectacle, it was in the details. Enslaved men and women wore placards around their necks, listing origins, defects, or skills like merchandise labels. Some bore chalk marks on their feet, signaling imperial taxes paid. Others had their hair dyed to hide gray, their wounds concealed with cheap ointments. Buyers weren't just purchasing labor, they were investing in longevity. A young field hand might cost less than a trained scribe, but if he collapsed from exhaustion within a year, was he really a bargain? The wealthiest patricians sent agents to scour markets for specialists, a Greek tutor fluent in rhetoric, a Gaulish blacksmith, a Syrian perfumer. These slaves commanded higher prices, but their expertise came with risk. A philosopher might poison his master's mind with subversive ideas. A medic could just as easily heal as harm. And then there were those deemed damaged goods. Runaways branded on the forehead, rebels hobbled by broken ankles, the elderly sold in bulk lots for a handful of denarii. The markets had a place for everyone because Rome's appetite for slaves was insatiable. War captives, abandoned infants, debtors all fed the machine. But perhaps the most chilling detail, the paperwork. Bills of sale survive to this day, dry legal documents that reduce human beings to entries like one female, aged 20, skilled in weaving, slight limp in left leg. These weren't just transactions, they were erasures. A name, a homeland, a family, all dissolved into ink on papyrus. Yet even here, in this calculated brutality, glimmers of defiance flickered. Some slaves exaggerated injuries to deter buyers. Others whispered warnings to those on the block. This master beats his servants, or the villa's steward starves the kitchen staff. And occasionally, just occasionally, a buyer's sharp eyes caught the fire in a slave's gaze and hesitated. Because every Roman knew the stories, the charioteer who sabotaged his owner's bets, the cook who accidentally served spoiled fish to a cruel mistress. A slave was property, yes, but property with hands that could grip a knife, a pen, or a throat. The market might strip them of dignity, but never of humanity. That truth simmered beneath every sale, unspoken but unforgettable. The first light of dawn didn't bring a new day. It signaled another grueling cycle of labor for a domestic slave in ancient Rome. Before the household's masters even stirred from their beds, slaves were already at work. The kitchen staff needed dough for bread, their arms aching as they prepared enough to feed dozens. Water carriers made countless trips to the well, their shoulders bowed under the weight of heavy amphorae. Every surface had to gleam before the master awoke. Marble floors were scrubbed, bronze fixtures polished, and fresh flowers arranged in precise patterns. There was no room for error. A single smudge on a mirror or a lukewarm bath could mean a beating or worse, but the morning rush was just the beginning. As the household came to life, slaves became ghosts in their own world, stepping silently out of sight when not needed. A maid might hold her breath as she poured wine, praying her trembling hands wouldn't spill a drop. A young boy tasked with fanning guests during a banquet would stand motionless for hours, his arms burning with fatigue. The work never paused. Between meals, there were clothes to mend, oil lamps to refill, and chamber pots to empty. Even during the rare lull, slaves were expected to look busy, dusting already spotless shelves or rewinding yarn that didn't need touching. The evenings brought no reprieve. While the family dined on elaborate dishes, slaves hovered at the edges of the triclinium, ready to refill a cup or whisk away a plate. Behind the scenes, others labored over the next day's preparations, grinding spices, soaking laundry, or trimming wicks for the night's lamps. Only when the last guest stumbled home drunk and the last ember died in the hearth did the slaves finally collapse, often in shared, cramped quarters where straw pallets served as beds. Yet even in this relentless grind, small acts of resistance and camaraderie flickered. A cook might slip an extra portion to a fellow slave. A whispered joke between laundresses could momentarily ease the weight of exhaustion. These tiny rebellions were lifelines, proof that no system could fully erase their humanity, because while Rome demanded their bodies, their spirits remained unbroken. For the slaves forced onto the blood-stained sands of the arena or onto the polished floors of banquet halls, entertainment was just another form of bondage wrapped in applause instead of chains. Gladiators, often prisoners of war or rebellious slaves, trained in brutal schools where every drill was a rehearsal for survival. Their lives dangled on the whims of the crowd. A thumbs down could end them as swiftly as a lion's jaws. Even the most skilled fighters knew their victories were temporary. A champion might earn wooden swords as a symbol of freedom, but most were simply recycled into the next spectacle, their bodies commodities to be spent. Meanwhile, in the lavish homes of Rome's elite, other slaves performed under softer but no less degrading spotlights. Musicians plucked lyres with fingers still sore from earlier beatings, their melodies masking the tension in their shoulders. Dancers twisted into impossible contortions, knowing a single misstep might mean punishment. And then there were the jesters, the human playthings ordered to swallow insults with a smile, their forced laughter a mask for humiliation. These entertainers were props in their masters' displays of wealth and power, their talents weaponized to impress guests. A particularly cruel host might demand a poet compose verses praising his own generosity, while the slave's empty stomach growled behind his smile. But the most insidious part, the illusion of privilege. A gladiator might be fed better than a field hand. A musician might sleep closer to the family quarters, but these were traps, not kindnesses. Comforts were calculated to make slaves complicit in their own exploitation. A fighter who embraced his fame might ignore the shackles on his wrists. A singer praised for her voice might forget she could be sold off the next day. Rome's genius lay in making some bonds invisible, turning pain into pageantry, fear into performance. Yet even here, in the glare of the stage or the roar of the Colosseum, defiance found cracks in the spectacle. Gladiators sometimes conspired to spare each other in the arena, subtly defying the crowd's bloodlust. A musician might weave a mournful folk song from her homeland into a cheerful tune, a hidden message to fellow slaves. These tiny acts were rebellion's proof that no amount of applause could drown out the quiet, unyielding truth. They were human, even when the world insisted they were props. Entertainment didn't just showcase Roman dominance, it revealed the resilience of those forced to perform it. Imagine knowing more than your master, speaking languages they couldn't comprehend, solving mathematical problems that baffled them, yet still kneeling at their command. This was the daily reality for enslaved tutors in Rome, whose intellects were prized even as their freedom was denied. These weren't just teachers, They were living libraries, often Greek captives from conquered cities like Athens or Alexandria, where education had been their birthright. Their new role molded the minds of Rome's future senators and generals while remaining invisible. A tutor's life was a tightrope walk between privilege and peril. He might dine on better food than the kitchen staff, sleep in a private alcove near the family's quarters, even earn a rare smile from his young charge. But these comforts were illusions of respect. One wrong lesson, a hint of Republican ideals slipped into a history lecture, a moment of defiance when correcting a spoiled pupil, could send him straight to the mines. His value was transactional. As long as the children recited Homer flawlessly or mastered geometry, he was tolerated. The moment his usefulness waned, so did his safety. The irony cut deep. These enslaved scholars were often the only ones who understood the true weight of the knowledge they imparted. A Greek philosopher teaching Stoicism might lecture on inner freedom while his own body bore the marks of shackles. A rhetoric tutor could train his pupil to argue justice in the forum, knowing no court would hear his own plea for emancipation. Their very existence exposed Rome's hypocrisy, a civilization built on enslaved minds teaching its elite how to think. Yet within this paradox flickered pockets of quiet rebellion. Some tutors smuggled subversion into their lessons, emphasizing Greek democratic ideals over Roman imperialism, or praising heroes who defied tyrants. Others used their access to the family's records to forge passes for fellow slaves, and when the household slept, they might whisper stories of their homelands to the kitchen staff, keeping memories alive like hidden embers. Because knowledge once given couldn't be taken back, every equation solved, every poem memorized was a silent reminder. The man they called slave was the one holding the keys to their children's future. Rome might own his hands, but his mind remained unshackled. The whip could break skin, but not spirit. Across Rome's sprawling estates and villas, resistance simmered beneath the surface, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in flames. A kitchen slave might accidentally oversalt a dish, sending a pampered mistress into fits of coughing. A scribe could deliberately misplace important scrolls, delaying his master's business dealings. These were quiet acts of sabotage, small but potent rebellions that proved even the most tightly controlled slave could wield subtle power. Then there were the bolder escapes. Fugitives risked everything: branding, crucifixion, or being fed to wild beasts for a chance at freedom. Some fled to the mountains, joining bands of runaway shepherds. Others disguised themselves as freedmen, blending into the chaos of Rome's crowded streets. The luckiest might find refuge with sympathetic plebeians, hidden in attics or smuggled onto ships bound for distant ports. But escape was a gamble with brutal odds. Professional slave catchers prowled the roads, armed with dogs and detailed descriptions. Rewards for runaways were posted in public squares, turning neighbors into informants. Yet the attempts never ceased, because for many, even a single day of freedom was worth dying for. And then there was Spartacus. His name alone sent shivers down the spines of Rome's elite. A Thracian gladiator turned rebel leader, he transformed a band of 70 desperate slaves into an army of thousands. For 2 years, they outmaneuvered legion after legion, burning villas and freeing fellow slaves in their wake. Spartacus wasn't just fighting for his own freedom. He was dismantling the myth of Roman invincibility. His rebellion proved that chains could be broken, that the mighty empire had vulnerabilities. Of course, Rome crushed the revolt in the end. 6,000 crucified bodies lined the Appian Way as a grisly warning, but the message lingered: no system of oppression is unshakable. Resistance wasn't always violent. Sometimes it lived in the stubborn preservation of identity, a whispered lullaby in a forgotten language, a scrap of fabric woven in the patterns of a lost homeland. Enslaved mothers secretly taught their children the names of ancestors they'd never meet. Cooks seasoned dishes with spices from homelands their masters had never heard of. These were acts of defiance too, a refusal to let Rome erase who they'd been before the auction block. The greatest irony, Rome relied on slaves for everything, from building aqueducts to raising children, yet feared their potential power. Laws forbade them from gathering in groups, from carrying weapons, even from looking a free citizen in the eye for too long, because the truth was undeniable. A system built on stolen labor could only survive if the stolen believed they had no choice. But in the shadows of every villa, in the silence between commands, that lie was being challenged. Every dropped plate, every feigned illness, every midnight dash toward the unknown whispered back, "We are not property. We are people," and that truth, more than any rebellion, was what Rome could never fully suppress. The weight of slavery wasn't just measured in chains or calloused hands, it pressed down on the mind, a relentless shadow no sunlight could pierce. Imagine living every moment under the gaze of someone who saw you as less than human, your every gesture scrutinized for signs of disobedience, a misplaced sigh, a moment's hesitation before obeying, even the wrong expression flickering across your face. Any of these could bring the lash down without warning. This wasn't just labor, it was a psychological siege where the rules shifted like sand, and the punishment was as much about fear as it was about pain. The torment went deeper than visible scars. Slaves lived with the constant knowledge that their families could be torn apart at a master's whim. A mother might cradle her child one night, only to wake and find them sold off to settle a debt. Partners whispered their goodbyes in the dark, knowing separation was always one bad harvest away. This ever-present dread, the inability to protect those you loved, gnawed at the soul, leaving wounds no physician could mend. Some accounts speak of slaves who simply stopped speaking, their voices buried under layers of grief. Others describe men and women who flinched at every sudden sound, their nerves frayed by years of unpredictable cruelty. Even sleep offered no refuge. Dreams became battlegrounds where the subconscious relived the horrors of the waking world. Some woke screaming, tangled in thin blankets that felt like shackles. Others drifted into exhausted numbness, their emotions dulled by relentless suffering. The poet Publilius Syrus, himself once enslaved, captured this torment in a single line: "The fear of punishment can never make a soul happy." Yet Rome's elites dismissed these struggles as mere weakness, as if a slave's pain were as insignificant as a cracked clay cup. The cruelest irony, slaves were often blamed for their own suffering. A woman who grew withdrawn after her child was sold might be labeled lazy or difficult. A man who startled at loud noises was mocked as skittish. Masters weaponized mental anguish, turning it into proof of inferiority. And yet, amid this devastation, resilience flickered like a candle in a storm. Some found solace in secret rituals, whispered prayers to forbidden gods, songs hummed in languages their masters couldn't understand. Others carved tiny moments of autonomy, a stolen glance between lovers, a shared joke with fellow slaves that turned their oppression into dark humor. The legacy of this trauma didn't vanish with emancipation. Freed slaves carried invisible burdens, nightmares that outlasted their chains, instincts honed by years of survival that made trust feel like a risk. Their children, though born free, inherited echoes of that fear, a silent undercurrent in families shaped by unspeakable history. Rome liked to pretend slavery was just an economic system, but its true cost was measured in shattered minds and silenced voices. And yet, even here, in the deepest darkness, the human spirit refused to be extinguished, because to suffer was to still feel, to remember was to defy, and in that defiance lay the unkillable truth: no one could own a soul. In the dim corners of Roman villas and the hushed spaces between labor, slaves found refuge in something no master could fully control: their faith. While Rome's official gods upheld the social order, promising favor to the powerful, enslaved men and women turned to deities who saw them differently. Cults like Mithraism, with its underground temples and secret rites, offered a brotherhood that ignored status. Early Christianity's radical message that the meek would inherit the earth resonated like a whispered promise of justice. These weren't just prayers, they were acts of defiance, a way to reclaim dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Some masters tolerated these practices, believing religion could pacify their slaves. A household might allow worship of Isis or Cybele in the servants' quarters, thinking devotion would distract from despair, but the irony was thick. The same rituals meant to soothe unrest often stoked it. When slaves gathered to chant hymns or share sacred meals, they weren't just honoring gods, they were building networks of trust, passing coded messages, and finding strength in unity. A midnight Mithraic initiation, where a slave knelt as an equal among fellow initiates, could stir a courage no whip could suppress. Then there were the masters who feared these gatherings like rebellion itself. Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians after the Great Fire wasn't just about scapegoating, it reflected a deeper terror. A faith that taught slaves they were equal in the eyes of God was dangerous. If heaven had no chains, why should earth? Authorities cracked down on mystery cults, sentencing followers to the mines or the arena. Yet the harsher the punishments, the more fervently some clung to their beliefs. A slave might face the lions with a hymn on her lips, her death becoming a sermon no one could silence. The most profound rebellion, though, wasn't in the grand gestures, it was in the quiet reshaping of identity. A Syrian slave might whisper prayers to Baal at dawn, keeping alive a homeland his master tried to erase. A Greek wet nurse could tell children stories of Prometheus, the god who defied tyranny to bring fire to humanity. Even the act of burying a fellow slave with proper rites, despite laws forbidding it, was a declaration: you mattered. Religion became the invisible thread connecting broken lives, a reminder that no empire could own their souls. And so, in the shadow of crosses and colosseums, an unshakable truth took root. The gods of Rome upheld power, but the gods of the oppressed promised something far more dangerous: hope. Not just for a better afterlife, but for the quiet victory of enduring, of remembering, of refusing to let cruelty define them. When a Christian slave etched a fish symbol on a kitchen wall, or a Mithraic initiate shared bread with a fellow bondsman, they were writing a history no victor could erase. Faith didn't just comfort the enslaved, it haunted the enslavers, because a man who believes he's seen by heaven can never fully bow to earth. Manumission papers might declare a slave free, but the ink dried with invisible strings still attached. In Rome, liberty was rarely absolute. It came with debts, duties, and the unshakable shadow of the past. A master could grant freedom as a reward for decades of loyalty, or as a calculated move to shift financial burdens onto an aging servant no longer worth feeding. Either way, the ceremony itself was steeped in symbolism designed to humiliate. Some owners tapped their former property with a rod during the ritual, a mocking reminder that their freedom could be revoked just as easily as it was given. Freedmen, known as liberti, walked a precarious tightrope between worlds. Though legally citizens, they were barred from holding office, marrying into senatorial families, or even wearing the pristine white togas of the elite. Their names bore the scars of bondage, often incorporating their former master's name like a brand. Marcus Tullius Tiro wasn't just a man, it was a walking advertisement that he'd once belonged to Cicero. And the obligations didn't end there. Many freedmen owed their patrons years of unpaid labor, a portion of their earnings, or blind allegiance in political votes. Refusal meant social ruin or worse, a one-way trip back to the auction block on charges of ingratitude. The cruelest twist for some, manumission was a trap in disguise. Wealthy patrons might free skilled artisans only to hire them back at starvation wages, knowing no other household would risk offending their former owner by offering better pay. Elderly slaves, released after a lifetime of service, often found themselves begging at the very gates they'd once polished. And for women, so-called freedom could mean being forced into sexual relationships with their patrons under the thin veneer of protection. Rome's laws framed manumission as an act of generosity, but the fine print whispered the truth. This wasn't liberation, it was rebranded exploitation. Yet even within this rigged system, sparks of defiance flickered. Some freedmen amassed staggering wealth as merchants or contractors, their success a silent rebuke to the aristocracy that still sneered at them. The House of the Vetii in Pompeii, with its lavish frescoes paid for by freedmen brothers, stood as a middle finger to the elite who'd once owned them. Others used their positions to secretly aid former fellow slaves, funneling money to buy their freedom or offering shelter to runaways. The social order demanded their gratitude, but their lives whispered a different story, one where every coin earned, every favor traded, was a step toward dismantling the hierarchy that had created them. Because in the end, Rome's greatest fear wasn't enslaved rebels, it was freedmen who remembered where they came from. A man who'd felt the lash might wear a citizen's ring, but his eyes would always see the cracks in the empire's glittering facade. And that made him dangerous. The whip left scars, but for enslaved women in Rome, the wounds ran deeper than flesh. While all slaves suffered under the weight of bondage, female bodies became battlegrounds where power and cruelty intertwined in uniquely devastating ways. Consider the teenage girl sold as a personal attendant to a wealthy matron, her days spent weaving elaborate hairstyles for her mistress while enduring pinches and slaps for every misplaced hairpin. Or the captured woman from Gaul, forced into the bed of the general who had slaughtered her family, her children bearing the face of their father's enemy. Roman law was clear. A slave's body belonged entirely to their owner, and for women that often meant their sexuality was just another resource to be exploited. Domestic service offered no protection. A kitchen maid might face groping hands from the master's drunken guests during banquets, knowing complaints would earn her beatings for lying. Wet nurses, prized for their ability to feed patrician babies, were sometimes kept perpetually pregnant to ensure a steady supply of milk, their own infants given away or left to die. Even trusted household managers, women who oversaw entire staffs with quiet authority, could be stripped of their status overnight if the master's whims shifted. Their value was always conditional, their safety fragile as glass. Concubinage draped rape in respectability. Wealthy Romans often kept enslaved women as long-term sexual partners, dressing them in fine silks but denying them any say over their own lives. These weren't relationships, they were ownership with a veneer of intimacy. Any children born from these unions automatically became slaves, their bloodlines to Roman citizens meaningless under law. Some masters eventually freed their concubines and offspring, but these acts were rarely kindnesses. A freed concubine remained socially tethered to her former owner, her reputation forever stained by her past. And her children, they were living reminders of a double standard. Roman men celebrated for their virility while the women they'd exploited bore the shame. Yet within this darkness, glimmers of agency persisted. Midwives whispered herbal secrets to help fellow slaves avoid unwanted pregnancies. Mothers taught daughters survival skills, how to feign illness when summoned to a master's chamber, how to hide small knives in their tunics. Some women turned the system's hypocrisy against itself. A concubine might leverage her influence to secure better treatment for her children, or a laundress could deliberately ruin the clothes of a particularly cruel mistress. These weren't victories, but they were refusals, tiny cracks in the empire's facade of absolute control. The cruelest irony lay in Rome's moral posturing. Elite women like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, were celebrated as models of virtue, while enslaved women faced blame for the very violations they endured. A slave impregnated by her master was called promiscuous. One who resisted was insolent. The system demanded their bodies while vilifying them for its own crimes. But the graffiti scrawled on Pompeii's walls tells another story. Names like Amamone, scribe and beautician, or Prima, who sings like a nightingale, fragile testaments to women who refused to be erased. Because Rome might have written the laws, but it couldn't silence their humanity. From the moment they drew their first breath, children born into slavery were already counted among their master's possessions, no different than a clay jug or a plow. Their futures were written before they could walk, their tiny hands marked for labor before they could grasp a finger. Some were torn from their mothers within days, sold to distant estates where their cries would never trouble the household that owned them. Others grew up in the shadows of their master's children, playing the same games, sharing the same nursery, until the day came when one child stood tall while the other knelt to fasten their sandals. The cruelty of this system lay in its precision. Slave children were raised to know their place, trained like dogs to respond to commands before they understood the words. A boy might be handed a toy sword at 5, only to have it replaced with a real blade at 12, not for glory, but to guard the very house that kept him in chains. A girl could be taught to weave alongside her mistress's daughter, her fingers moving just as skillfully over the loom, yet her creations would never belong to her. The lessons were relentless: obedience first, humility always, and the unspoken truth that their bodies were not their own. Some masters saw profit in nurturing certain talents. A quick-witted child might be schooled in numbers to keep accounts, a pretty one groomed for future service in the master's bed, but these privileges were traps. The more useful a slave became, the more valuable and the less likely they'd ever be freed. And when adolescence came, so did the reckoning. Playmates became masters overnight. A boy who once raced his patrician counterpart through olive groves now bowed as that same boy ordered him to scrub floors. The betrayal cut deeper than any lash. Yet even here, in this calculated erasure of childhood, resistance took root. Mothers sang lullabies in forbidden languages, stitching fragments of lost homelands into their children's memories. Fathers carved tiny toys from stolen wood, proving love could flourish even in barren soil. And sometimes, against all odds, bonds formed between slave and freed children that defied the system's secret alliances, where a patrician's son might sneak food to his foster brother, or a daughter hide her nurse's tears from a wrathful parent. These cracks in the empire's foundation were small, but they mattered, because every child who remembered kindness carried the seed of a question: if we can play as equals, why can't we live as equals? Rome built its future on the backs of these children, never realizing their greatest threat wasn't rebellion, it was memory. A boy who recalled his mother's stories could never fully believe he was meant to kneel. A girl who once tasted fleeting friendship might someday dare to demand more. The generational cycle of slavery relied on broken spirits, but the human heart, once touched by dignity, is not so easily shattered. The auction block was where lives fractured, where a person became a price. In the heart of Rome's busiest markets, the air buzzed with haggling voices as merchants paraded their human wares on raised platforms. Buyers elbowed forward, prodding at limbs, demanding demonstrations of skill or strength. A scribe might be ordered to recite passages from Virgil, a dancer forced to twist her body to the snap of a whip. Even children weren't spared, tiny hands examined for dexterity, voices tested for clarity, their futures decided in the time it took to count out coins. But the cruelty of these markets wasn't just in the spectacle, it was in the details. Enslaved men and women wore placards around their necks, listing origins, defects, or skills like merchandise labels. Some bore chalk marks on their feet, signaling imperial taxes paid. Others had their hair dyed to hide gray, their wounds concealed with cheap ointments. Buyers weren't just purchasing labor, they were investing in longevity. A young field hand might cost less than a trained scribe, but if he collapsed from exhaustion within a year, was he really a bargain? The wealthiest patricians sent agents to scour markets for specialists, a Greek tutor fluent in rhetoric, a Gaulish blacksmith, a Syrian perfumer. These slaves commanded higher prices, but their expertise came with risk. A philosopher might poison his master's mind with subversive ideas. A medic could just as easily heal as harm. And then there were those deemed damaged goods. Runaways branded on the forehead, rebels hobbled by broken ankles, the elderly sold in bulk lots for a handful of denarii. The markets had a place for everyone because Rome's appetite for slaves was insatiable. War captives abandoned infants, debtors all fed the machine. But perhaps the most chilling detail, the paperwork. Bills of sale survive to this day. Dry legal documents that reduce human beings to entries like one female, aged 20, skilled in weaving, slight limp in left leg. These weren't just transactions, they were erasures. A name, a homeland, a family, all dissolved into ink on papyrus. Yet even here, in this calculated brutality, glimmers of defiance flickered. Some slaves exaggerated injuries to deter buyers. Others whispered warnings to those on the block. This master beats his servants, or the villa's steward starves the kitchen staff. And occasionally, just occasionally, a buyer's sharp eyes caught the fire in a slave's gaze and hesitated. Because every Roman knew the stories, the charioteer who sabotaged his owner's bets, the cook who accidentally served spoiled fish to a cruel mistress. A slave was property, yes, but property with hands that could grip a knife, a pen, or a throat. The market might strip them of dignity, but never of humanity. That truth simmered beneath every sale, unspoken but unforgettable. The crack of the whip wasn't just a sound, it was a language. Every lash spelled out the same message: you are nothing. Roman masters wielded pain with precision, turning the human body into a canvas for their cruelty. A slave who spoke out of turn might return from punishment with shoulders striped raw, the wounds deliberately left uncovered as a warning to others. Branding irons seared runaways with letters like "Fug" for fugitivus, marking them as property even if they reached the city gates, and for those who dared outright rebellion. The cross awaited a slow, public agony designed to terrify far beyond the victim's last breath. But the true horror lay in the calculations behind the violence. Punishments weren't random outbursts of rage, they were performances. A steward might order a beating in the courtyard where all could see, timing the strokes to coincide with the master's return home. Theatrical cruelty served a purpose: break spirits without damaging valuable assets. A field hand could be whipped bloody, yet still expected to work the next dawn, his pain a lesson to the others. Women often suffered doubly, their punishments laced with humiliation, like being forced to grind grain on their knees after a flogging, their tears mixing with the flour. Some masters preferred psychological torment. A favored slave might be forced to whip a friend, his hands guided by the overseer's grip. Others staged mock executions, letting the noose tighten just enough to steal breath before, mercifully, commuting the sentence to exile in the mines. The unpredictability was the point. Slaves could never gauge what infraction might trigger wrath, a spilled cup, a delayed response, even the wrong expression. This constant uncertainty coiled like a snake in the gut, paralyzing dissent before it could form. Yet even in this economy of terror, cracks appeared. Whispers told of slaves who learned to muffle their cries during beatings, denying their masters the satisfaction of hearing pain. Others used herbal poultices to hasten healing, turning their scars into hidden badges of resilience. And sometimes, just sometimes, a master's overreach backfired. A particularly brutal punishment might stir quiet solidarity among the enslaved. A cook accidentally burning the torturer's meal, a gardener letting weeds choke his favorite roses. Rome's violence sought to isolate, but suffering could also bind, because when every whipstroke reminded them they were property, the silent understanding between slaves whispered back, "We are people." And no amount of blood could wash that truth away. The fields stretched endlessly under the Mediterranean sun, a green and gold expanse that hid unimaginable suffering beneath its bounty. While household slaves navigated the invisible traps of aristocratic villas, those condemned to agricultural labor faced a different kind of hell, one measured in blistered hands, broken backs, and the relentless rhythm of the harvest. Chained together in work gangs, they moved like specters through olive groves and wheat fields, their iron collars glinting in the light that would eventually kill them. This wasn't just labor, it was industrialized cruelty. Overseers armed with whips timed tasks to the beat of a drum, pushing slaves to work faster until their fingers bled from stripping vines or their knees gave way from planting seedlings. The wealthiest estates operated like factories, where human beings were as replaceable as cracked plowshares. A man who collapsed from heatstroke might be dragged to the roadside and left for scavengers, his spot in the chain filled by a fresh arrival before sunset. Women heavy with pregnancy were given no reprieve. Accounts tell of infants born between furrows, their first breaths choked with dust. The scale of this exploitation fueled Rome's insatiable appetite. A single villa might enslave hundreds to produce the wine, grain, and olive oil that stocked elite pantries and fed the legions. The math was coldly logical. A slave cost less than 3 years' wages for a free laborer, and unlike livestock, they could repair their own tools. But the true horror lay in the details, the way sunlight reflected off the metal tags around their necks, each engraved with their master's name. The way their rations were calculated to keep them working just long enough to turn a profit before being worked to death. The way their bodies, when finally spent, were dumped into mass graves without markers, their lives erased as thoroughly as last year's harvest. Yet even here, in this calculated dehumanization, flickers of resistance took root. Some field hands sabotaged crops by planting weeds among the wheat or accidentally breaking irrigation channels. Others preserved forbidden seeds from their homelands, nurturing them in secret patches of soil like silent acts of rebellion. At night, when the overseers slept, songs in forgotten languages drifted between the barracks, a reminder that no chain could bind memory. Rome called this progress. They built aqueducts and amphitheaters with the wealth wrung from these fields, never acknowledging the truth. Their civilization's grandeur was fertilized with stolen lives. Every loaf of bread, every flask of wine carried the invisible weight of those who'd harvested it beneath the lash. The fields demanded everything and gave back only graves. But the earth remembers what empires forget. Long after the last slave gang dissolved into dust, the land itself would whisper their stories. The marble floors of a Roman villa might have felt cooler underfoot than the sun-baked earth of a latifundia, but both were scenes of the same tragedy playing out in different acts. Urban slaves, those serving in wealthy city homes, existed in a strange limbo between privilege and peril. They slept in slightly cleaner quarters than their rural counterparts, wore less ragged tunics, and sometimes even enjoyed fragments of education passed down from literate masters. But these superficial comforts were traps designed to make them more useful, not more free. A literate slave could manage accounts or read correspondence, making them invaluable. A well-dressed servant reflected the family's status. These were investments, not kindnesses. Meanwhile, on sprawling rural estates, the brutality was unadorned. Field slaves worked from dawn until their bodies gave out, their lives measured in harvests rather than years. Unlike urban domestics who might develop uneasy familiarity with their masters, rural laborers often knew their owners only as a name on an iron collar. Distance allowed for greater cruelty. Overseers could whip a man to death without the master ever knowing or caring. The sheer scale of agricultural slavery numbed conscience. When your workforce numbers in the hundreds, individual suffering blurs into the landscape. Yet the divide between city and country slavery wasn't just about pain, it was about purpose. Urban slaves sustained the elite's daily illusions of grandeur, the perfectly timed dinner parties, the spotless atriums, the well-tutored heirs. Their suffering was hidden behind tapestries and polished silver. Rural slaves fed the empire itself, their backs bending under the weight of Rome's insatiable appetite for grain, wine, and olive oil. One group maintained the facade of civilization, the other fueled its engines. The true genius and horror of Roman slavery lay in this division. By fracturing the enslaved population into hierarchies of misery, they prevented unified resistance. A house slave in Pompeii might pity a chain gang in the fields, but would never risk his slightly softer bed to help them. A vineyard worker, crushed by exhaustion, lacked the energy to conspire with urban servants. Rome didn't just exploit slaves, it isolated them, ensuring that no single act of rebellion could shake the system. But isolation couldn't extinguish recognition. Sometimes, when a wealthy family summered in the countryside, urban and rural slaves would glimpse each other's lives. The house servant carrying a sunshade for his mistress might lock eyes with a field hand whose shoulders bore permanent scars from the whip. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In that silent moment, both understood their suffering was different, but their chains were the same. And that knowledge, fleeting as it was, terrified Rome more than any rebellion. Because when the enslaved realized they weren't alone, the empire's carefully constructed walls began to crack. In Rome, even fabric could be a prison. The clothes slaves wore weren't just practical, they were advertisements of ownership, carefully designed to erase identity and broadcast subjugation. A rough wool tunic, dyed the cheapest shade of brown, marked its wearer as clearly as any brand. Some masters went further, forcing slaves to shave half their heads or wear iron collars engraved with the owner's name, human property tags that jingled with every step. These weren't just uniforms, they were psychological shackles, ensuring no one forgot their place. The rules varied by household. Wealthy patricians might dress their domestic staff in matching linen tunics, not for comfort, but to impress guests with their coordinated staff aesthetic. A well-dressed slave reflected the master's taste and wealth, but crossed the threshold into the kitchens or stables, and the fabric grew coarser, the colors duller. Hierarchy extended to threads. A Greek tutor might wear a cloak reminiscent of his homeland, while a field hand wrapped himself in rags stiff with sweat and dirt. For women, the stakes were higher. A beautiful enslaved girl could be draped in silks and jewels not as gifts but as bait. Dressed to accentuate her figure, she'd serve wine at banquets, knowing the wrong glance from a guest might doom her. Others endured the humiliation of wearing their mistresses' cast-off gowns, the fabric frayed but still finer than anything they'd ever own. The message was clear: even their beauty wasn't theirs to control. The cruelest twist: some slaves were deliberately dressed to mimic freedom. Trusted stewards accompanying their masters to the forum might wear near-identical togas, blurring the line between slave and citizen, until a sudden command revealed the truth. This illusion of dignity made the eventual humiliation cut deeper, because in Rome, clothing didn't just cover the body, it exposed the soul's position. A slave could scrub his skin raw, but the fabric clinging to his shoulders would always whisper, "You belong to someone else." Yet even here, in this calculated erasure, small acts of defiance emerged. A laundress might accidentally shrink her cruel mistress's favorite shawl. A young man traded his iron collar for a leather one stolen from a dog, disguising his status just long enough to slip into a tavern unnoticed. And in the quiet of the barracks, enslaved women wove hidden patterns into cloth tribal motifs from homelands they'd never see again. These threads of resistance were fragile, but they proved one unshakable truth: no master could fully control how a person chose to wear their chains. The bread was coarse, the wine thin as water, and the olives often rancid. This was the sustenance that fueled the bodies building Rome's empire. While patricians reclined on couches, gorging on stuffed dormice and honeyed peacock, their slaves subsisted on rations calculated to keep them working, not thriving. A typical daily portion might consist of a single loaf of rough barley bread, a handful of olives so bitter they made the tongue curl, and a cup of posca, a vinegary wine mix so diluted it barely stained the water. These weren't meals, they were caloric transactions, measured out just enough to prevent collapse but never enough to foster strength. Sleep offered no respite. In grand villas, slaves often bedded down in windowless storerooms or dank cellars, their pallets little more than sacks stuffed with straw. The air hung thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and damp wool, the darkness punctuated by coughs and restless murmurs. In larger households, they slept in shifts, sharing spaces with rats and spiders, their rest interrupted by the occasional cry of a child or the scuff of sandals as night duty workers came and went. There were no blankets in winter, no relief from summer's stifling heat, just the relentless rhythm of exhaustion. Disease prowled these cramped quarters like an uninvited guest. Malnutrition left slaves vulnerable to fevers that raced through the ranks, while dysentery from contaminated water could decimate a household's workforce in days. A cough that began in the grain storage room might end in the mines as masters discarded sick slaves like spoiled fruit. Some accounts describe children with bellies swollen from hunger, their ribs pressing against skin as they scrounged for fallen crumbs in the kitchen. Others tell of elderly slaves, their teeth ground down from years of chewing tough bread, left to starve when they could no longer work. Yet even in this calculated deprivation, ingenuity flickered. Kitchen slaves smuggled scraps to the weakest among them, hiding bones for broth or hoarding bruised fruit. Laundresses soaked rags in vinegar to mask the stench of unwashed bodies, while those with access to gardens foraged for wild garlic or nettles to stretch their rations. These weren't just acts of survival, they were quiet rebellions. Every stolen bite, every shared sip whispered the same truth: Rome could control their labor, but not their will to endure. The cruelty of this system lay in its hypocrisy. The same masters who penned treatises on humane treatment counted coins rather than calories when feeding their workforce. A philosopher might debate ethics over dinner while his slaves licked porridge from cracked bowls in the next room, but the body remembers what the empire forgot. The calloused hands that built aqueducts, the aching backs that harvested olives, they carried the unspoken cost of Rome's grandeur. and sometimes in the dead of night, the scent of a stolen fig or the warmth of a shared blanket became a promise, we are still here. In the shadowed halls of Roman power, where senators schemed and emperors plotted, an unlikely class of influencers moved silently, slaves who shaped the empire's destiny with whispered advice and deft hands. These weren't field hands or kitchen drudges. They were literate, multilingual, and politically astute, their minds sharper than the daggers hidden in their masters' robes. A Greek slave fluent in rhetoric might draft speeches that swayed the Senate. A Syrian scribe could intercept or subtly alter a rival's correspondence. For the elite, these enslaved advisors were living weapons, their loyalty bought not with wages but with the fragile promise of better treatment. The irony was brutal. A slave like Cicero's Tyro, who invented shorthand to record every political nuance, held more real knowledge than the patricians he served. His shorthand system, the noti tyranni, became the empire's declassified language of power, yet he remained property. Such men navigated the labyrinth of Roman politics with no safety net. Their influence hinged entirely on their master's survival. When Sejanus, Tiberius's infamous advisor, fell from grace, his entire household was executed alongside him, secretaries and all. Their crime, knowing too much, this precarious existence forced enslaved politicians to master a deadly dance. They had to be insightful enough to be useful, but never so brilliant as to outshine their owners. A well-placed suggestion could earn a rare smile. An overstep might mean a midnight trip to the mines. Some, like Claudius's freedman Narcissus, played the game perfectly, amassing wealth and sway until he effectively governed Britain's conquest from the shadows. But even he met a grim end, ordered to suicide when his emperor died. The most heartbreaking figures were the imperial slaves, those who served the palace itself. A eunuch might control access to the emperor's chambers, deciding which petitions reached his ears. A scribe could lose damning documents or mishear treasonous whispers. Their power was real, but it came with a knife's edge existence. One day they might broker peace treaties, the next they could be tortured for secrets they'd overheard. Yet within this gilded cage, flickers of agency remained. A secretary might slip a warning to a fellow slave about an impending purge. An interpreter could soften a foreign envoy's words to prevent war. These weren't just acts of survival, they were quiet rebellions against a system that demanded their brilliance but denied their humanity. Because Rome never admitted the truth, its political machine relied on the very people it claimed were incapable of thought. And that contradiction haunted the empire like a ghost in the Senate house. While Rome's legions marched to glory under their crimson banners, an invisible army toiled in their shadow, slaves whose hands built the empire's victories but whose names vanished from history's scrolls. These were the men who dug the trenches before dawn, their shovels biting into frozen earth as legionaries slept. The ones who hauled water skins across scorching battlefields, their backs bent under weight that would crush a mule. Officially, Rome's military might belong to free citizens, but conquest relied on enslaved labor as surely as it did on swords. The tasks were grueling and unglamorous. A slave might spend days repairing armor in a smoky field forge, his lungs filled with soot as he hammered dents from breastplates. Others followed the baggage train, their fingers calloused from knotting ropes that secured siege engines during treacherous mountain crossings. Some were forced to clear the dead after battles, dragging stiffened corpses by their ankles through mud stained red. Their work was essential without it. Armies starved, weapons dulled, and campaigns stalled, yet no triumphal arch would ever depict their faces. What made this servitude particularly cruel was its proximity to freedom. A legionary could earn land and citizenship for 20 years of service. but the slave who sharpened his sword or tended his horse received only another day of chains. Some masters deliberately used military slaves as psychological weapons, forcing them to walk ahead of troops through enemy territory, human shields against ambushes. Others gifted skilled artisans to legions as portable workshops, their hands crafting everything from nails to catapults while their bodies remained property. Yet even here, in this calculated erasure, glimmers of defiance emerged. A blacksmith might subtly weaken a centurion's sword hilt, ensuring it would snap at a critical moment. Water carriers whispered warnings to sympathetic soldiers about cruel officers, and when battles turned desperate, some slaves seized their chance, melting into the chaos to vanish beyond Rome's reach. Their absence from the record speaks volumes, because an empire that documented every sack of grain and every tax receipt somehow forgot to count the hands that made its wars possible. The truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. Rome's conquests were built as much by the enslaved as by the free. A broken bone or raging fever meant more than pain for a Roman slave. It was a death sentence in slow motion. Masters kept detailed ledgers calculating whether a sick worker was worth the cost of treatment or cheaper to replace. A young field hand with strong muscles might warrant a poultice or a few days' rest, but an aging servant coughing blood was more likely to be dragged beyond the estate gates and left for scavengers. Medical care wasn't about compassion. It was cold arithmetic where human lives carried price tags instead of names. Wealthy households sometimes employed enslaved physicians, Greek doctors captured in wars or trained from childhood in the healing arts. These men walked a razor's edge, expected to cure their master's gout with precious imported herbs, while doling out vinegar-soaked rags to fellow slaves with infected wounds. Their knowledge could buy small privileges, extra rations, a private sleeping space, but their hands were tied by their owner's whims. A slave doctor might know exactly which plant could ease a laborer's pain, yet be forbidden from wasting it on disposable workers. The true horror lay in the suffering deemed unworthy of attention. Childbirth was a death lottery for enslaved women, left to deliver on dirt floors without midwives. Miners with crushed limbs were abandoned in tunnel collapses rather than carried to safety. Even simple injuries festered into gangrene when slaves were forced back to work with open wounds, their bandages nothing more than torn strips of filthy cloth. Accounts survive of slaves begging for death rather than enduring another day of untreated agony, their pleas sometimes granted not out of mercy, but to stop the noise disturbing the master's dinner. Yet glimmers of humanity persisted. Some slave physicians risked beatings to smuggle willow bark tea to feverish kitchen staff. Wet nurses secretly rubbed honey on the burns of scullery children scalded by careless attendants. And in the darkest corners of the barracks, enslaved healers practiced forbidden remedies from their homelands, whispered incantations over crushed herbs, prayers to gods Rome had tried to erase. These acts defied the empire's cruelest lie, that some lives weren't worth saving, because every stolen moment of relief, every clandestine treatment, proved that even in chains, they still cared for one another. And that, perhaps, was the most subversive medicine of all. History often speaks in the voices of the powerful, but if you listen closely, you can hear whispers from those who are meant to be silenced. The personal accounts of Roman slaves survive in fragments, scratched onto pottery shards, hidden between the lines of legal documents, or echoing through comic plays where the enslaved outwit their masters. These fragile traces are more than historical footnotes. They're proof that even in bondage, humanity refuses to be erased. Take the graffiti etched into a wall in Pompeii by a slave named Crescens, bragging about his romantic conquests in crude but lively Latin. Or the heartbreaking legal petition from a woman named Acte, begging a judge to prevent her owner from forcing her into prostitution, her words preserved on papyrus by some miracle of bureaucracy. Even the plays of Plautus, though written for laughs, reveal uncomfortable truths when enslaved characters mock their master's greed or feign stupidity to avoid work. These weren't just stock characters, they were inside jokes that resonated with an audience who knew the realities of servitude firsthand. Some of the most poignant voices come from unexpected places. A bill of sale might casually mention a slave's skill at singing sad songs, as if their grief were just another line item. A philosopher like Seneca would praise his enslaved secretary's intellect in one breath, then defend slavery as natural in the next. The dissonance is jarring. How could Rome acknowledge slaves as thinkers, artists, even friends, yet still insist they were property? The rarest treasures are the moments when slaves speak unfiltered. A first-century curse tablet from Britain, buried by an enslaved cook, calls down divine wrath on his tormentor. May he who whips me choke on his own bile. Not a plea for mercy, but a raw cry for vengeance, or the epitaph of a freedman named Tiberius Claudius Eutychus, who carved his life story into his tombstone, from chains to prosperity, ensuring his journey wouldn't be forgotten. These fragments matter because they shatter the myth of passive victimhood. When a gladiator's epitaph boasts, "I won 21 battles," or a child's clay doll is found hidden beneath a servant's pallet, we're reminded these were people who loved, raged, and dreamed beyond their circumstances. Rome tried to reduce them to ledger entries, but their stubborn humanity bleeds through the cracks of history. Every scratched word, every hidden artwork, every defiant joke is a whisper across centuries. We were here. And no empire, no matter how vast, could silence that truth. Rome's grandeur was built on a foundation of stolen labor, and like all empires that feed on exploitation, it carried the seeds of its own destruction within its walls. The sheer scale of Roman slavery wasn't just a moral stain, it warped every aspect of society, from the economy to the very mindset of its citizens. Elite landowners grew addicted to the endless stream of enslaved workers, their lavish lifestyles propped up by a system that treated human beings as disposable tools. When conquest slowed and fresh captives stopped flooding the markets, cracks began to show. Farms faltered without enough hands to till the soil, mines ran dry when workers died faster than they could be replaced, and the once mighty machine of empire started grinding to a halt. But slavery's legacy wasn't just economic, it seeped into Rome's soul. Generations raised with unchecked power over others became cruel and decadent, their humanity eroded by the casual brutality of ownership. The poet Juvenal mocked his fellow citizens as bread and circuses addicts, too numb to notice their world crumbling. And why should they care when every comfort, from heated baths to polished marble floors, came at the stroke of a slave's hand? Effort itself became foreign. The same elites who lectured about Roman virtue couldn't dress themselves without help. This toxic dependency left the empire brittle, unable to adapt when crises hit. The echoes of this system still reverberate today. Modern supply chains, built on underpaid labor in distant factories, mirror Rome's reliance on invisible workers. The billionaire's yacht, the fast fashion wardrobe, even the smartphone in your hand, each carries traces of an ancient bargain, convenience for some, suffering for others. Roman slavery was extreme, but its logic that certain lives are expendable for the comfort of a privileged few hasn't vanished. It's just taken new forms. Confronting this history isn't about casting judgment on the past. It's about recognizing patterns. When societies dehumanize workers, whether through chains or starvation wages, they repeat Rome's fatal mistake. The empire's ruins stand as a warning. No civilization can thrive forever when its wealth depends on denying others dignity, yet there's hope in the resistance then and now. Just as Roman slaves whispered prayers for freedom in barracks, modern laborers organize for fair wages. The thread connecting them is the unshakable belief that no one is born to be broken for another's profit. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson etched into those ancient stones. Hollywood loves painting Roman slavery with a soft brush, loyal servants smiling as they pour wine, devoted nannies cradling their masters' children, even gladiators basking in glory. These comforting illusions couldn't be further from the truth. The reality was a system designed to strip away identity, where even the most privileged, enslaved person lived under the constant threat of violence. Take the myth of the happy household servant. Yes, some slaves wore finer tunics and slept closer to the family quarters, but their comfort was a leash, not a gift. A Greek tutor might dine on better food, but one misplaced word during a lesson could send him to the mills. A trusted steward managing his master's finances knew his position hinged on absolute obedience. The moment his calculations displeased, his privileges vanished. Another dangerous fiction is the idea of slavery as a temporary hardship, a stepping stone to freedom. While manumission did exist, it was rare, conditional, and often came with strings tighter than chains. Freedmen remained bound to their patrons socially and financially, their new status a gilded cage. And for every slave who earned freedom, thousands died in bondage, their bodies broken by labor or discarded when they outlived usefulness. The notion that slavery was somehow gentler in Rome than on later plantations ignores the chilling efficiency of Roman exploitation. Mines swallowed workers whole, their lifespans measured in months. Agricultural slaves toiled until their backs gave out, replaced like worn-out tools. The empire didn't just use people, it consumed them. Perhaps the most insidious myth is that slaves passively accepted their fate. Resistance wasn't just Spartacus and his rebellion. It was the daily acts of defiance that kept dignity alive. A cook accidentally burning a meal, a scribe subtly altering a ledger, a mother teaching her child a forbidden lullaby. These were battles fought in whispers. Rome's entire legal system trembled at the possibility of slave uprisings, passing harsh laws to prevent gatherings or even casual conversations. Why such fear? Because the empire knew its foundation was brittle. A system built on stolen labor only works if the stolen believe they have no choice. Dispelling these myths isn't just about historical accuracy, it's about refusing to sanitize suffering. When we romanticize Roman slavery, we erase the millions whose unpaid labor built an empire, whose stolen lives funded its art and wars. Their stories deserve more than pretty lies. They deserve the uncomfortable truth that Rome's glory was built on backs that ached, in silence that screamed, under whips that never stopped swinging. Rome's slave system may have been the engine of an empire, but the brutal practice of owning human beings didn't start or end with the legions. Step into ancient Athens, and you'd find a society that prided itself on democracy while keeping a third of its population in chains. Greek slavery was often less industrialized than Rome's, but no less cruel. Enslaved miners in the silver-rich veins of Laurion worked in tunnels so narrow they could never stand upright, their lungs filling with dust until they suffocated. Household slaves in Sparta, known as helots, outnumbered their masters so drastically that the city-state's entire military culture revolved around suppressing potential revolts. The Greeks even had a chilling term, andrapodismos, for the mass enslavement of conquered cities, a practice Rome would later perfect on an unimaginable scale. Venture further back to Egypt's New Kingdom, and the picture shifts again. Pharaohs built pyramids not with slave gangs as Hollywood loves to depict, but with conscripted laborers who, while brutally overworked, still had legal rights and could petition for grievances. True slavery in Egypt targeted foreigners, particularly Nubians and Syrians, who were branded, bound, and forced into domestic servitude or temple labor. Yet, unlike Rome, where slaves were ubiquitous across all levels of society, Egyptian slavery was often tied to specific royal projects or elite households. A scribe's ledger from Thebes lists 30 Syrian slaves gifted to a vizier, each carefully categorized by age, skill, and even temperament, like livestock at a market. Then there was Carthage, Rome's greatest rival. The Carthaginians took slavery to grotesque extremes, sacrificing children of enslaved families to their gods during crises, a practice even some Romans found monstrous. Yet in a bitter twist, when Rome finally crushed Carthage, they enslaved the entire surviving population, proving the victors could be just as ruthless. The differences between these systems weren't about morality, but logistics. Athens primarily enslaved other Greeks through warfare and debt bondage. Egypt preferred targeted enslavement of outsiders. Rome industrialized the process, turning entire regions into human supply chains, the most telling contrast. Manumission. Greek slaves could sometimes buy freedom with hard-earned wages, and Egyptian slaves occasionally married into free families. But Rome's freedmen remained forever marked by their past, barred from political office and socially tethered to former masters. This wasn't just slavery, it was a caste system designed to perpetuate hierarchy long after the chains came off. What unites these civilizations isn't just their cruelty, but their contradictions. Athens birthed philosophy while denying personhood to thousands. Egypt's medical papyri detail healing remedies written by the same hands that recorded slave punishments. Carthage's merchants traded spices and suffering in equal measure. Rome didn't invent slavery, it just refined it into a machine that fed an empire's insatiable hunger. And that legacy raises an uncomfortable question. When we admire these ancient wonders today, how many silent voices are still buried beneath the marble? The life of a slave in a wealthy Roman household was a relentless tug of war between survival and erasure. Every polished floor they scrubbed, every goblet they filled, every silent tear they swallowed became invisible threads in the tapestry of Rome's grandeur, while their own names vanished like footprints in the sand. Yet if we listen closely, their voices still echo through time, not in the speeches of emperors or the edicts of senators, but in the cracks between the stones they laid with bleeding hands. Consider the small acts of rebellion that history almost overlooked. A mosaic in Pompey's house of the Vetii shows a slave boy grinning as he steals fruit, his mischief immortalized in tile. Graffiti in a tavern's backroom preserves a joke mocking a miserly master, scrawled by someone who risked a beating to etch that laughter into stone. Even the legal records tell unintended stories, like the court case of a woman named Petronia Erster, who spent years battling to prove she was born free after being raised as a slave. These fragments matter because they prove something Rome tried desperately to deny. The enslaved were never just background characters in their own lives. The legacy of Roman slavery isn't confined to ancient scrolls. Its shadow stretches into modern systems where human dignity still battles against exploitation, whether in sweatshops, migrant labor camps, or the algorithms that profit from invisible digital toil. The same questions Rome wrestled with: who deserves freedom, what justifies cruelty, still haunt us today. That's why these stories aren't just history, they're mirrors. When we recognize the humanity of those Rome called property, we sharpen our eyes to see the invisible chains of our own era. So the next time you admire a Roman fresco or quote a Latin phrase, remember the hands that made such luxuries possible. Not as a footnote, but as the heartbeat beneath the marble. Their suffering doesn't diminish Rome's achievements, it exposes the price tag attached, and that's a truth worth carrying forward. If this journey through history's hidden corners resonated with you, let's keep the conversation alive. Drop your reflections below and join us as we continue unearthing the stories that shape our world. The past isn't finished speaking. Are you listening?